Hi, this is the Tropical Tidbit for Tuesday, September 12th. We continue to watch Hurricane Lee, which we've been tracking for at least a week as it's moved to the north of the Eastern Caribbean. It's going to turn north to the west of Bermuda and perhaps bring impacts to the northeastern US and southeastern Canada going into this weekend. We also have Hurricane Margot, which we won't be discussing as it will stay meandering out over the open ocean, a threat only to shipping. And there's a new invest, a tropical wave in the eastern Atlantic, which may develop as it moves northwest, but is no imminent threat to land. But focusing on Lee here, this is the close-in loop of the hurricane, which is now reaching the mature latter stages of its life cycle. This was once a Category 5 hurricane with winds as strong as 160 miles per hour when it was east of the Caribbean. It's undergone a weakening phase when it had elevated wind shear that brought it down, and a couple of eyewall replacement cycles have occurred since then, which has really broadened out the wind field. You can see a bit of a ragged eye, it's not fully clear, and we have multiple bands wrapping tightly around that eye, and this is a much broader wind field than it used to be. And typically when the wind fields get very broad, it puts a ceiling on the hurricane's maximum winds. So this is currently a Category 3 hurricane with max winds of about 115 miles per hour, and it may not get much stronger than that again on its way north. It will likely be capped around that Cat 3 kind of area. This is the reconnaissance aircraft observation showing this large field of purple around the hurricane, showing that expansive wind field, everything in purple over hurricane force at flight level, about 60 mile per hour winds at the surface or so, everything in purple there, just showing that this is now a quite large hurricane, winds still above 100 miles per hour in the inner core in that eye wall. Now, as far as the track forecast for Lee, this has been what we've been watching for the last several days in terms of potential impacts to North America. We know that this is going to pass first and foremost west of Bermuda. So as this comes up in a couple of days, you'll see that on most models, it's about 150, 200 miles west of Bermuda, and that's where the NHC official forecast is as well. That is close enough to bring Bermuda into the tropical storm force wind field of Lee, but not close enough to bring it into the inner core of Lee with hurricane force winds. So we'll likely see a tropical storm watch go up for Bermuda soon, but unlikely to see hurricane conditions, which is good news. A bit of a narrow dodge, similar to Hurricane Franklin, which passed to the north of Bermuda a couple of weeks ago, but did not directly impact the island with the core of the storm. So if we go back here, this is Wednesday afternoon, and the big steering feature is this trough, upper level trough over the Great Lakes, kind of in blue here, and you can see these black contours curved in a smiley face shape, kind of translating to the east over New England, and this is bringing southwesterly flow to the eastern seaboard, which is helping to usher the hurricane toward the north. And you can see the outline of this ridge to its east, again with southerly flow. So this will start to accelerate the hurricane toward the north. But the real key piece to the forecast is going to be how quickly this trough swings through New England and then exits toward the northeast and leaves the hurricane behind for a moment. Now on the GFS actually has this trough just a little bit slower to leave, and it brings Lee up quickly enough that it's able to move directly north-northeast right toward Nova Scotia after that trough leaves. So it does move right into southeastern Canada here by Saturday morning. But there are models that have a slightly different outcome. For example, the European model, which on Friday morning has Lee located right here. Now, if we go back to the GFS and go back to 12Z Friday, you'll see that the GFS has Lee centered here at the same time. So you can see the difference in forward speed between the two models, where the European model is slower than the GFS by Friday morning. This ends up mattering a lot because you can see the upper level trough is just now leaving on the European model. So it's pulling out. And when that happens, because the hurricane is farther to the south, it's a little slower to come north, that allows time for this ridge to build in behind that trough when the trough leaves, which forces Lee back toward the west, and we see a bend toward the left closer to Cape Cod by the weekend. And this is very different from a track over western Nova Scotia. So you can see already how the potential impacts from Lee and which areas will receive significant weather will really depend on this track. And there's a lot of uncertainty that comes out here in the ensemble related to that slow versus fast paradigm for the track. This is the European ensemble for Thursday morning, showing the area of possible locations in red numbers. This is a 51 member ensemble, and you can see that the average location is right there in the center, and you can see a little bit of uncertainty around that, but mostly circular to the southwest of Bermuda by Thursday. But as this comes north, you'll see it spread out. This becomes what we call a long track spread, where some of these red numbers are racing out farther ahead. They're faster moving toward the northeast, but then some numbers are slower and take a while to get by Bermuda. And you'll see that as we continue forward in the forecast, the fast group of members tends to move up into Nova Scotia or the eastern Gulf of Maine right away, but the slower members end up hooking farther to the left and end up closer to Cape Cod and New England and the western Gulf of Maine. So that's exactly like that dichotomy we just saw between the slow European deterministic run and the fast GFS deterministic run. So faster and to the east, slower and to the left seems to be the source of uncertainty right now. And which one will actually occur, we still don't really know. This is about 4 or 5 days out, and so things could still change and shift around, but this exact track will matter a lot for who gets the significant weather impacts from Lee as it comes north. Now, talking about impacts, the earliest one that we'll see, and of course Bermuda is going to see impacts long before the United States or Canada will, but the entire coastline here of the eastern seaboard will see elevated waves. This is the significant wave height forecast from the European model, just as an example, showing that the field of elevated wave activity and high surf will be spreading into the eastern seaboard over the next few days, and then spreading northward into New England and Canada. So regardless of the exact track of the hurricane, expect elevated surf, great for surfers, but dangerous for the average beachgoer, and coastal erosion and some coastal flooding could occur due to these tall waves. And then eventually, we'll also have coastal flooding from the onshore flow around the north side of the hurricane, which could bring easterly and northerly winds into New England, pushing water toward the coastline, and then southerly winds pushing into Nova Scotia, again, depending on the exact track, but storm surge will occur as the hurricane gets closer to these land areas. Now let's talk about the other impacts from the storm. This is the HAFS model showing the sea surface temperature that the hurricane is moving over. And of course, right now, the hurricane is over warm water, 27, 28 degrees Celsius. That's why it's a major hurricane with winds over 100 miles an hour. But you'll notice, and this is always true in the Atlantic, the Gulf Stream is meandering here, this ribbon of warm water to the north. And to the north of that line, the water gets quite cold. And that's always true off of New England. So as Lee comes northward here, it gets north of the Gulf Stream, and it enters this area of cold water. This will induce weakening of the maximum winds. So it will be a hurricane by the time it crosses the Gulf Stream, but when it gets north of the Gulf Stream, we could see weakening below hurricane force. And one of the aspects of Lee's forecast track is that it could actually slow down. And if we look back at the steering feature, again, this trough is ushering the hurricane northward, causing it to accelerate at first, but then the trough leaves, which means that the steering flow also slackens off a bit. We get this ridging building into the north, and the hurricane may actually slow up as it moves into the Gulf of Maine, and so we could see it actually decelerate in its forward motion. And counterintuitively, this may actually be a good thing in terms of impacts, because the slower the hurricane moves, the more time it has to move over this cold water and weaken as it moves over that cold water. And a slowing track here would be different than most New England hurricanes. The prototypical New England hurricane races up from the southwest and moves into New England at an accelerating pace, moving 30, 40 miles per hour. And that gives it very little time over the cold water with which to weaken. And that's how you can get big wind events in New England from recurving hurricanes. In Lee's case, it's probably going to be slower moving based on the forecasts right now, which means it will be decaying in terms of maximum wind. That doesn't mean it won't be impactful. But hurricane force winds would be a bit of surprise in a situation like this. Tropical storm force winds, though, between 40 and 75 miles per hour will still occur around this large circulation, and it will be a large area that has that elevated wind. But in an ideal case, a slowing track up into the eastern Gulf of Maine could allow the wind field to decay enough that wind impacts are much less than a typical hurricane taking this kind of track. This is the wind field from that model. You can see the large area of green indicating winds of 40 miles per hour or stronger. So it's a very broad hurricane, and that will be the case all the way up here. And you can see that even once it's southeast of Cape Cod, it hasn't gotten to the coastline of Maine or Canada yet, but you can see that tropical storm force winds already battering Cape Cod from the north. And this is what we need to watch for in terms of coastal flooding, the potential for wind gusts spreading along the coast and inland, bringing the potential for power outages, things of that nature. But you can see as the track moves up into the Gulf of Maine that the maximum winds do decay, and so the longer it takes to move over that cold water, the less the wind impacts will become. So that's kind of the best case scenario, is that it moves slowly over that cold water for a while. You can see southerly fetch into Nova Scotia as well. Again, the exact track will determine how strong these winds and the associated storm surge and coastal flooding would be, and whether it moves into Nova Scotia or closer to Cape Cod will make all the difference there. There's also going to be the potential for heavy rainfall, especially if the hurricane is moving slowly, like we talked about. This is the European model early Saturday morning, showing that there's a lot of warm advection on the northwestern side of the hurricane, which is centered right about here. There's all this easterly flow coming around the northern side of the hurricane, and not dissimilar from a winter nor'easter, this causes a lot of warm air to be lifted up and above a cooler air mass over New England. So as this easterly flow lifts above that, it causes a lot of rainfall, primarily to the west and north of the hurricane. So if we look at the actual rainfall forecast, you'll see that indeed the most intense coloring here is on the western side of the center of Lee, and this will likely be transitioning into a non-tropical cyclone as it makes its final approach toward North America. This will not look like a typical hurricane when it gets to this spot. That won't really change the impacts so much, but it is worth noting that the strongest impacts from rain especially will be mostly on that northwestern side. So even if the track is not directly into Cape Cod, you can see that rain does spread inland. So we'll watch the products from the National Weather Service to see if there's potential for flash flooding inland from this as it moves up, especially if it lingers for a while in the Gulf of Maine and drops rain for several hours. This is the official forecast from the National Hurricane Center, showing that track again to the west of Bermuda by about 150 or 200 miles overnight on Thursday. That's Bermuda right here. And we'll likely see a tropical storm watch for winds over 40 miles per hour on the eastern side of Lee sometime tonight. NHC usually waits until 2 or 2.5 days in advance of tropical storm conditions to issue that watch, and that's where we'll be by about tonight. So overnight, Thursday, it moves beyond Bermuda and then accelerates toward the north, and then may slow down a little bit like we talked about as it moves toward the Gulf of Maine. Right now, the official forecast is actually into Nova Scotia. We've seen some models shift eastward toward that location today, but as we talked about, there is still potential for a little hook toward the left that could bring it closer to Cape Cod and Maine and New Hampshire at the end of the forecast. And this is still 4 to 5 days out, so there is some uncertainty here. So it's important to just be prepared in case the hurricane comes close enough to bring some of those elevated winds, potential for power outages, coastal flooding, etc. And just know your vulnerability and know whether you have susceptibility to some of these hazards as this comes up. This is not going to be on par with big events from history like Hurricane Sandy or the 1938 hurricane in New England. That's not what this event is going to be, but there will be hazards. So keep an eye out for your National Weather Service for warnings as we go through the next few days and see what impacts are expected in your area. We'll nail down the details of this track over the coming days and hopefully have more clarity as to what areas of Nova Scotia and New England could see what kinds of weather from Hurricane Lee. That's about it for this video. Stay safe, everyone. Thanks for watching.